I'll bring on board Siddharth Purohit and chat a little bit more about this. Siddharth, hi, morning. Would you say this is a positive news because, all the poison gets out of the system and this opaqueness like we were discussing this morning around the IL&FS exposure which banks have is then out in the open?
Yeah, hi, good morning. In fact, as you rightly said, there had been a lot of confusion with regards to the exposure to IL&FS by various banks, and there was no clarity which bank has how much exposure. And now this directions by RBI will give a very clear picture that individual banks will have to now on a footnote to declare what is the exposure to IL&FS group and how much provisions they have done on it. So while there is still a kind of regulations by NCLAT that still without their permission the accounts will not be tagged as NPA. But as an investor, as an analyst, what we look at is that whether sufficient provisions has been done towards that particular asset or not. And if now this directive allows banks to disclose separately the quantum of exposure and the provisions taken on them, then it certainly gives a lot of clarity and comfort to the investor community that how far the bank is positioned toward this asset. So banks which are having a lot of exposure towards the holding company, then certainly they will need more provisions. And banks which are now having relatively exposure to the operating companies might be not necessarily they're relieved, but at least we know that some asset might get sold up at a later stage. So now I think more clarity will come because of this thing, and that is certainly will be a good factor for investors in general.
Which bank do you think has not been very forthcoming about the IL&FS exposure, and where do you think the charge or the hit could be the highest?
See, if you look at as a percentage of total sales, within the private banks, IndusInd Bank had the highest exposure. They had roughly about 3,000 crores total exposure to the group and 2,000 crores to the holding company. And if you see, already they had done roughly about 600 crores of provisioning in the last 2 quarters, and they had clearly said that in the fourth quarter we'll increase the provisioning. So now, and Yes Bank also has sizable exposure to the group. So among private banks, as a percentage to total assets, if you look at them, IndusInd has the highest and Yes Bank has. Though large banks like Axis and ICICI also has significant exposure, but as a percentage to total sales, total loans, it looks a little lower. So IndusInd certainly, to my understanding, has a higher exposure, and they are now taking extra provisions on that. Now, those banks which have not also taken provisions will now have to give a footnote on the result during this season that whether the amount has been adequately provisioned or not. So that gives a comfort to the investor. That's what I was trying to say.
All right, Siddharth, thanks so much for joining us this morning. And clearly the line coming in, as we were discussing earlier, that this will be reassuring